Before the last Targaryen king was driven from power, the dragons were already gone. Every single one of them. The greatest weapons the world had ever known, extinguished not by enemies, but largely by the Targaryens themselves. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Let the weight in your shoulders soften. Let your jaw unclench, and let your hands rest open against whatever they are resting on tonight. We are going very far back, further than most histories dare to venture, into an age of the world so remote that even the characters living through the main events of this story spoke of it the way we speak of myth, with reverence, with incomplete knowledge, and with the quiet sense that they were seeing only the shadow of something they could no longer fully behold. You do not need to hold anything tightly tonight. Let the names and the events move through you the way water moves through cupped hands, not to be grasped, but only to be felt. What we are searching for is not a catalogue of facts. It is a feeling, the feeling of deep time, of a civilization so powerful and so vast that its destruction altered the very shape of the world and of one family, one single, outwardly unremarkable family who survived that destruction and carried whatever fragments they could manage into a new age that had absolutely no idea what was coming for it. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the concerns of the day release their grip on you. We begin long before the Iron Throne existed. We begin long before Westeros itself was anything more than a wild, green and largely ungoverned land. We begin in a place called Valyria, and we begin there because everything the Targaryens ever were, everything they ever did or dreamed or destroyed, traces its roots back to that lost world and to the catastrophe that ended it. The Valyrian freehold was not built in a day, and it was not built by a single mind or a single will. It grew across thousands of years, slowly at first, the way all truly immense things grow, through accumulation, through inheritance, through the patient extension of influence from one generation to the next. At the heart of it sat a great peninsula, ringed by a chain of volcanic mountains the Valyrians called the 14 Fires. These were not gentle hills softened by distance and time. These were breathing, groaning, smoke-shrouded mountains whose summits glowed deep orange in the darkness and whose lower slopes had been reshaped, across centuries of unhurried labor, into roads and building foundations and drainage channels carved directly from the hardened remains of ancient lava flows. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. It was beneath those mountains, in the vast layered networks of cavern and tunnel that honeycombed their interiors, that the Valyrians first encountered dragons. Not as solitary beasts to be hunted from a cautious distance, and not as rare wonders stumbled across by luck. They found them as a population, nested, breeding, already ancient by the time the first Valyrian shepherds pushed into the dark places where they slept. The exact history of how the Dragonlords established their bond with these creatures is one of the most fiercely debated questions in the scholarship of that world, and one of the least satisfactorily answered, for the simple reason that the people who best understood it were the ones who perished before they could pass that understanding on to anyone who survived. What is known is that the bond was blood deep. It was not a matter of training, the way a horse can be trained, or even a raven taught to carry messages across great distances. It was something carried in the body itself, passed from parent to child, concentrated across generations of careful marriage within the same bloodlines. A Valyrian dragonlord did not command their dragon the way a general commands a soldier. They communed with it through something older than language, older than conscious intention, through a form of knowing that bypassed the reasoning mind entirely and spoke to something deeper and more instinctual beneath it. The dragon did not simply obey, it recognized, and in that recognition, something passed between them that made both the rider and the beast more than they had been separately. The freehold that this bond allowed was a confederation of roughly 40 Dragonlord families, each with their own dragons, their own territorial holdings, their own webs of alliance and rivalry. It was not ruled by a single emperor seated on a jeweled throne. It was governed by a council, by consensus, by the complex and often imperfect machinery of a civilization that had learned, through several generations of bitter experience, that concentrating too much power in a single pair of hands was especially dangerous when those hands could also direct a fully grown dragon. The freehold was, in its peculiar way, an oligarchic arrangement, not a democracy of the common people who were enslaved in enormous numbers to build and maintain the infrastructure of Valyrian civilization, but a careful balance of power among the Dragon Lords themselves, who understood that the moment that balance broke, the consequences would be unlivable. House Targaryen was one of the lesser families in that aristocracy. Not the most powerful, not the most celebrated or the most feared. They occupied a position at the respectable margins of Valyrian political life, known, connected, present at the right gatherings, but never at the centre of anything. They bred their dragons. They maintained their estate. They practiced the ancient customs of their class, including the tradition of keeping marriages within the family, wedding sibling to sibling or cousin to cousin, in order to concentrate the specific qualities of bloodline that permitted dragon bonding. This practice, which would later disturb and unsettle every people the Targaryens encountered in Westeros, was not a Targaryen invention or a Targaryen peculiarity. Every Dragonlord family in the freehold did it. The Targaryens simply continued the tradition longer than anyone else had the chance to do. And then there was Daenerys. Daenerys Targaryen, called Daenerys the Dreamer by the histories that came after her, was a young woman, perhaps 14 years old, when she began to have visions of the end of the world. Not the vague, layered, heavily symbolic prophecies that characterized most prophetic experience in this world, where meaning was buried beneath metaphor and required years of careful interpretation to unpack. What Daenerys dreamed was specific and concrete. She dreamed of fire coming not from the sky, but from below. She dreamed of the 14 fires erupting in cascade. She dreamed of the peninsula fracturing at its foundations, of the sea flooding inward, of the libraries burning, of the accumulated scrolls of 12,000 years of civilization dissolving in smoke. She dreamed of the dragons, every dragon in Valyria, screaming as they died. It is worth pausing here for a moment. Not hurrying toward what comes next, but sitting with what this moment actually means. A young woman told her father she had dreamed the end of the world, and her father believed her. Aenar Targaryen was not, from the records we have, a particularly distinguished figure before this moment. He was a Valyrian lord of moderate standing, comfortable, not ambitious, respected in a mild way, and not especially remarkable. But in response to his daughter's dream, he made one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the known world. He sold his Valyrian properties. He gathered his household, his wealth, as many scrolls and records as could be carried, without slowing the journey too much. He loaded his 5 dragons, great Balerion among them, Maegor and Meraxes, and 2 others whose names the later histories did not preserve, onto ships. And he sailed west, across the narrow sea, to a cold, rocky island at the far western edge of the world's maps. a former Valyrian outpost called Dragonstone, sitting at the mouth of Blackwater Bay, like a dark tooth rising from grey, restless water. He was mocked. He must have been. The image of the Valyrian aristocracy, watching the Targaryen household load its ships and sail for a bleak fortress rock at the edge of the known world. That image contains more irony than almost any other moment in this history. They were abandoning the most sophisticated civilization on Earth, the Watchers must have thought, leaving culture and refinement and wealth and the accumulated prestige of generations because a child had a bad dream. The things people must have said, watching those ships diminish toward the western horizon. 12 years passed in the ordinary way that years pass, slowly and with the particular mundanity of ordinary life. Then the doom came. What it actually was, what geological or magical catastrophe triggered the simultaneous eruption of most of the 14 fires, the fracturing of the land, the flooding of the sea, is a question the scholars and meisters of that world never definitively resolved. The peninsula cracked, the waters rushed in, the cities were buried under ash and lava and ruin, the roads were buried, the libraries were buried, every other Dragonlord family gone, every other bonded dragon gone. 12,000 years of Valyrian civilization, the most sophisticated culture the world had ever produced, reduced within perhaps a single day to ash and silence and the specific quality of emptiness that follows the end of very loud things. Sit with that if you can. Do not move past it too quickly. 12,000 years of civilization ended in a day. The most powerful empire in the history of the known world, destroyed by the very mountains it had been built around, and the only survivors among all the great Dragonlord families were the ones who had been laughed at for believing a girl's dream. What the Targaryens brought with them to Dragonstone was not the totality of what Valyria had been. That was never possible, could never have been otherwise. But it was what they had. 5 dragons, including Balerion the Black Dread, already immense, already old, already carrying in his dark scales the memory of an earlier age. The High Valyrian language, maintained in their household with the care of a people who understood that language is the vessel of memory, and that once the language was truly lost, the last traceable connection to where they came from would dissolve along with it. The blood, the silver hair, the eyes of violet and lilac, the quality that servants always noticed and never quite found the right word for, whereby fire seemed to be friendlier to them than it had any reason to be. And something else survived, something more difficult to name. A sense of purpose, a feeling carried through the family across the generations between the Doom and the Conquest, that the cold island on which they lived was not a destination, but a staging ground, that the wild continent across the water, with its 7 fractious kingdoms and its ancient castles, and its vast, ungoverned, largely unrecorded millions of people, was not simply a neighbour. It was a future. When you listen to the name Daenerys Targaryen, born on Dragonstone in the middle of a storm centuries after the Doom, consider what that name carries. She is the last daughter of a dynasty that itself was the last remnant of a civilization that no longer exists. She speaks High Valyrian with the accent of a diaspora community that has been separated from its homeland for 300 years. She has the silver hair and the violet eyes, and the inexplicable warmth in the presence of fire. All the inherited marks of a people who are otherwise completely gone from the world. What she calls her birthright is, if you look at it truly, the inheritance of a catastrophe. She is the survivor of a survival. Jon Snow, who carries Targaryen blood without knowing it, who is Aegon, son of Rhaegar, raised as Ned Stark's bastard among the grey cold stones of Winterfell, is even further removed from the source. The dream of Valyria, preserved through centuries of careful and costly practice, lives in a man who has spent his entire life believing himself the product of a dishonour his father could never bring himself to fully explain. The oldest blood in the world runs in him like a language he was never taught and has no idea he is speaking. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. Let that settle now. Let it soften at the edges, the way smoke softens when the fire beneath it goes out. The image of a great civilization reduced to memory, and one family carrying that memory westward to an island fortress where the winds were cold and the sea was grey and the waiting had only just begun. There is more to this story, much more. But every long story has to begin somewhere. And this one begins in fire. Not the fire of conquest or of revenge, but the quiet, barely audible fire of a family sitting on a cold rock at the edge of the world, watching the smoke from something enormous rise above the eastern horizon. And slowly, in the silence that followed, beginning to understand that they were the only ones left. Let your breathing be still. Let your body be warm and heavy. The history is here, and it will wait for you through the night, and it will continue whenever you are ready. And if sleep finds you somewhere in the middle of this, that is not a loss. That is exactly where you're meant to arrive. The night is long. The history will keep. Let your watch be rested, just for now. What happened next would take 100 years. 100 years of cold wind off the narrow sea, of dragons circling above a fortress no one was particularly interested in attacking, of a family slowly becoming something different from what it had been, something harder, something quieter, something that had learned to wait. What they were waiting for, even they may not have been entirely sure. But they were Targaryens, and they dreamed, and eventually the dream arrived. Let your breathing slow again. Let the names that are coming settle on you gently, like the ash that must have fallen for weeks over the ruins of what had once been the greatest civilization in the world. We are still in the long silence now, the 100 years between the doom of Valyria and the day a man named Aegon loaded his family onto 3 ships and sailed for the coast of a continent that had no idea he was coming. 100 years is a long time to wait. But the Targaryens were good at waiting. They had nothing else to do. Dragonstone was not a comfortable place. This matters more than it might seem, because the Targaryens who ruled from it for those 100 years were not simply marking time in a pleasant exile. They were living on a volcanic island of dark stone and cold wind, and the particular loneliness of being the last of something. The castle they inhabited had been built by Valyrian hands, and it showed. The towers were carved in the shapes of dragons. The walls were smooth and seamless, in a way that the stonemasons of Westeros could not replicate and could barely explain. And the stone itself seemed to hold a faint warmth even in the coldest months, as if the island remembered what it had been shaped to house. The world outside Dragonstone was still reeling from what had happened in the east. The Doom did not only kill the Valyrians, it destroyed the architecture of power that the Valyrian freehold had imposed across the entire eastern continent of Essos. The roads the Valyrians had built still existed. Those roads were astonishing things, and they outlasted their makers by centuries. But the order they had connected was gone. The free cities, which had all been Valyrian colonies in one form or another, found themselves suddenly, disoriently independent. There were wars. There were the bleeding years, when the cities fought each other with a violence born partly of genuine political competition, and partly of the panic of people who had always had someone above them to organize the world, and suddenly did not. And there was, in some of the stories told afterward, the shadow of things that crept in from the east. As the Valyrian order dissolved, things that had been kept at bay by the dragons, and now tested the edges of the world with renewed boldness. The Targaryens on Dragonstone watched this from a distance. They were not passive. They traded with the free cities. They entered into careful diplomatic relationships, offered their dragons as a deterrent to those who might otherwise have been tempted to annex the island. They built their household. They maintained their customs, their language, their practice of intrafamily marriage, their traditions of dragon-keeping. They had, through the accident of Aenys' flight, ended up with more dragons than any single entity left in the world. And they understood that this made them valuable, and also that it made them a target. And these two facts required constant, careful navigation. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. The language they spoke on Dragonstone was High Valyrian, not the degraded pidgin form that the free cities had developed from it, but the formal, precise, sonorous original. Children learned it before they learned the common tongue of Westeros. They named their dragons in it. They recorded their histories in it. And in maintaining that language with such deliberate rigor, the Targaryens were doing something that mattered enormously, even though it looked, from the outside, simply like stubbornness. They were keeping alive a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world that had no other vessel left. High Valyrian was not merely a language. It was the encoded experience of 12,000 years of a civilization that had no other survivors. Every sentence spoken in it, in the cool halls of Dragonstone, was an act of resistance against forgetting. The generations passed in the way generations do, marked by births and marriages and small conflicts and the ordinary textures of life. While underneath, something was slowly shifting. The Targaryens began to dream differently. Aegon, the man who would eventually cross the narrow sea, was the descendant of Aenys and Daenerys. He was, depending on how you count, approximately the 5th generation of Targaryens to live on Dragonstone. And from what the records suggest, he was a man who from his earliest years carried a quality of purposefulness that those around him noticed and found difficult to describe. He was not impatient. He was not grandiose. He was simply, in the accounts of those who knew him, a man who seemed to have somewhere to be. Aegon had 2 sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, and he took both of them as wives following Valyrian tradition without particular apology. Visenya was the elder. Stern, capable, a warrior as naturally as she was anything else. A woman whose composure was not the composure of someone suppressing feeling, but of someone who had decided that feeling was subordinate to purpose. Rhaenys was the younger, warmer, more curious, more interested in the people she encountered than in the strategies that organized them. Between the two of them, they constituted something like a complete picture of the complexity that Aegon himself seemed to contain only partially. He was neither as cold as Visenya, nor as warm as Rhaenys, but was instead a man of singular clarity, of the kind that tends to simplify very complicated situations into the one question that actually matters. There was also a prophecy. There is always a prophecy in this world, lurking somewhere beneath the surface of the events that seem to explain themselves without one. Aegon knew, from the dreams his family carried, from the tradition of true seeing that ran through the Targaryen line, that a great darkness was coming. Not immediately. Not within his lifetime, perhaps, or within the lifetimes of his children. But coming, the long night, which the histories of the North remembered as the winter that had lasted a generation, and brought something terrible out of the darkness beyond the wall, was not, in Aegon's understanding, a finished story. It was the first chapter of something that had not yet found its ending. And the weapon against that darkness, when it came, would need to be ready. It would need a house behind it. It would need a king. This is the piece of the Targaryen history that is most easily missed in the spectacle of what follows. The fire, the battles, the conquest, the forging of a throne from 1,000 defeated swords. Aegon's conquest of Westeros was not at its deepest level a power grab. It was a preparation. He wanted to unite the Seven Kingdoms because he believed, on the evidence of his family's prophetic tradition, that a divided continent would not survive what was eventually coming from the north. He wanted the Iron Throne not because he particularly desired to sit on it, but because sitting on it was the most efficient way to ensure that the Seven Kingdoms would function as a single coherent thing when the moment arrived that they needed to. Whether this was wisdom or rationalization, whether Aegon truly believed the prophecy or found it a convenient justification for ambition that would have existed regardless, is a question the histories have never fully resolved. What is undeniable is that he acted on it, and that the Seven Kingdoms, which had spent centuries fighting each other in small, costly wars over borders and succession and pride, were about to be reorganized entirely. Think about what Westeros looked like before Aegon landed. 7 kingdoms, though in truth the political geography was more complicated than that simple number suggests. The north, ruled by the Starks from Winterfell, was enormous but sparsely populated, a cold territory that governed itself through the particular authority of people who have lived long enough in a hard place to understand what hard places require. The Westerlands under the Lannisters were wealthy in ways that translated directly into military capability. The Stormlands, the Vale, the Reach, each with its own character, its own dynasty, its own memories of old grievances and old alliances. And the Riverlands, over which everyone seemed to fight, perpetually. As if the rivers themselves were the cause of the conflict rather than simply the border. And Dorne in the far south. Dorne is worth noting separately because it would be the one region that Aegon did not conquer, not in the end, not in the same way. The Dornish fought differently than the Westerosi kingdoms. They refused pitched battle, melted into their deserts and their mountains, harassed supply lines, and accepted losses of land with a willingness that mystified commanders who assumed land was what wars were about. They held, in the end. Which means that from the very beginning of the Targaryen reign over Westeros, there was a limit, a territory at the edge of the map that the dragons had not subdued, and that the Iron Throne did not truly own. That fact would matter for centuries. Ned Stark, 280 years after Aegon's landing, was governing the same north that the Starks had governed before the Conquest, with the same values, the same architecture of authority, the same relationship between the Stark family and the people of the north that had existed before any dragon had ever flown in the skies above Winterfell. The Conquest changed the title. It changed the relationship to the south. But in the deep textures of how things actually worked in the north, the Targaryens left surprisingly little trace. The Starks bent the knee and went on being Starks, which tells you something both about the nature of what Aegon built and about the nature of what the Starks were. What tells you even more, perhaps, is the prophecy itself. Aegon's dream, recorded in what became known as the Song of Ice and Fire, warned of a winter that would end the world. And the instrument of that winter's defeat would need to be a Targaryen, a dragon, a rider, the marriage of fire to something else. The seat of the Starks and the blood of the dragon joined. It would take 300 years for that marriage to happen. And when it finally did, neither party would fully understand what they were enacting. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen would not think of themselves as the fulfillment of Aegon the Conqueror's dream. They would be too busy surviving the long night to have time for that kind of historical perspective. But the dream would be there underneath it all, as it had always been, ancient, patient, slowly becoming true. Let the darkness of Dragonstone settle around you now, the cold walls, the carved dragons looking down from the towers, the sound of the sea at night, which is a sound that goes on forever without explanation, and asks nothing of the listener except that they receive it. Let that sound be with you for a moment, just the sea and the dark and the long patience of people who believed they had somewhere to be but had not yet arrived. There is nothing you need to hold tonight. Let your body be heavy and still. The history keeps its own time, and it does not require you to rush. What comes next will come. It has always been coming. And it arrived, in the end, exactly when it was supposed to arrive. The night is long. The dragons are circling above Dragonstone in the dark, and the morning that is coming, the morning that will change everything, is still one long, quiet, necessary sleep away. 3 dragons, 3 riders, an army that never exceeded 3,000 men, against 7 kingdoms with hundreds of thousands of soldiers between them. By every rational measure of military power, what Aegon attempted was not a conquest. It was a vanishing act dressed up as one. And yet it worked. The question of why it worked, and at what cost, is the question that echoes through everything the Targaryen dynasty would later become. Let your body settle a little more deeply into its rest. Let your breathing slow to its own natural rhythm, without direction, without effort. We are moving now into the part of the story that most people think they know. The conquest, the fire, the birth of the 7 kingdoms as a single political entity. But knowing the broad shape of a story and truly resting inside it are different things. Let yourself rest inside this one. Let it be slower than you expect. Aegon landed on the eastern shore of Westeros in the year that the histories of that world would eventually designate as year 1 of the Targaryen era, the year from which all subsequent events would be counted forward. He came with his 2 sisters, his 3 dragons, and an army of approximately 1,500 soldiers, supplemented eventually by allies gained along the way. Against this force stood the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, with their collective armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, their castles built over centuries to withstand siege, their lords experienced in the particular brutal art of Westerosi warfare. The disparity was so extreme that if you did not know the outcome, you would say that Aegon was not conquering anything. He was attempting something that should have ended within weeks in disaster. But he had dragons, and this changes the arithmetic of war entirely, in ways that no amount of careful strategic preparation can account for, until you have actually stood in a field and watched a living, thinking creature, the size of a large house, breathe fire across everything in front of it. The armies of Westeros had never faced dragons in battle. They had heard of them, the way people hear of things they have read about but never experienced, with a kind of intellectual acknowledgement that leaves the emotional reality entirely unprepared for. When Balerion the Black Dread came over the horizon at the Field of Fire, the largest dragon ever to fly over Westeros, with a wingspan that darkened the ground beneath him, and fire that burned in colours that ordinary fire did not reach, gold and black and something at the centre that was so hot it was almost white. The armies below him did what any army in human history has done when it encountered something its training had not prepared it for. They broke. The Field of Fire was the one-pitched battle of Aegon's Conquest, where all three dragons flew together: Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes. The combined armies of the Reach and the Westerlands, two of the most powerful military forces in Westeros, allied against the common threat, met Aegon's forces on the grass of the Reach and outnumbered them many times over. 4,000 men died in the Dragonfire that day. 4,000 men, in a matter of hours, most of them not killed in combat but simply burned where they stood, in the particular terrible efficiency of Dragonfire, which does not discriminate and does not tire. The Westerlands bent the knee shortly after. House Lannister submitted. The Reach submitted. The Stormlands, which had been Aegon's first ally, were already his. Harrenhal deserves its own moment of attention, because it is one of the most vivid demonstrations of what dragons mean in the context of military architecture. Harren the Black, who had built his enormous fortress on the shores of the God's Eye over the labour of 40 years, was so confident in his walls, and those walls were genuinely impressive, the tallest in Westeros, built to outlast any army ever assembled, that he refused to surrender and refused to leave, and apparently believed that stone thick enough could stop anything. Aegon sent him a message, asking him to yield. Harren refused. That night, Balerion flew over Harrenhal and breathed, and the stone towers, the towers Harren had considered impregnable, began to melt. Not crack, not shatter. Melt. The stone flowed. Men died inside walls they had trusted completely. And the lesson Westeros learned that day, a lesson that would echo through the psychology of the continent for generations, was that there is no fortification strong enough if the thing you are defending against does not follow the rules that fortifications were designed to oppose. Harrenhal still stands, cursed and half-ruined, the melted battlements hardened back into new and alien shapes. Centuries later, when Arya Stark hides inside its walls and learns to become something other than what she was, the castle around her carries this history in its very stone. The malformed towers that shelter her are the direct physical consequence of a dragon that lived 3 centuries before she was born. History in this world is architectural. It does not disappear into the past, but persists in the structures that the living still inhabit. Not everyone bent the knee without resistance. The Arryns of the Vale withdrew to their mountain fortress, the Eyrie, and declined to come down. They were not conquered so much as outlasted. Eventually, they yielded not to overwhelming force, but to the gradual impossibility of sustaining a position of independence when everything around you had reorganized itself. The North was different. Torrhen Stark, the king in the North, assembled his forces, the largest single army in Westeros, the North being enormous if sparsely populated, and marched south to meet Aegon. He camped his forces on one bank of the Trident. Across the water, Aegon waited with his dragons. What happened next was not a battle. Torrhen Stark waded across the river, knelt in the mud, and surrendered his crown. He was called the king who knelt ever afterward, and that name was meant partly as an insult, and partly as the kind of recognition that doesn't quite find the word it's looking for. Torren understood something that many men in his position would not have. He understood the difference between pride and arithmetic. Ned Stark, 3 centuries later, would inherit this calculus, the question of when to kneel and when to refuse to, and what the costs of each choice actually are. Ned made the choice Torren chose not to make. He refused to bend, and the history that followed showed what refusal costs. It is tempting to read Torren's surrender as weakness. But the North endured. The Starks endured. The people Torren was responsible for, the farmers, the craftsmen, the small folk of the enormous northern territory, survived and continued and had children and grandchildren who lived. Ned's honor was real and mattered and was in its way more beautiful than compromise. But Torren's pragmatism saved the North. Both things can be true, and the fact that they can is one of the reasons this history is worth sitting inside rather than just passing through. Dorne did not submit. This is the other essential fact of the Conquest. The fact that the map Aegon drew was never quite complete, never quite closed. The Dornish, under Merya Martell, fought the Targaryens not in pitched battle, but in something more exhausting and ultimately more effective. They refused to be where the dragons were. They surrendered their cities and reclaimed them later. They harassed supply lines. They survived losses that would have broken any army that measured success in terms of territorial control. And when the war finally reached the point where Rhaenys and Meraxes were lost, when the dragon who had flown through the Dornish campaign was brought down, through means the histories record only partially and with visible discomfort, Aegon pulled back. Dorne remained outside the kingdom for another century and a half, until it was brought in not by conquest, but by marriage, and by the kind of exhausted diplomacy that follows generations of pointless conflict. The Iron Throne itself was built after the conquest was complete, or complete enough. Aegon ordered that the swords of the defeated lords be brought to King's Landing, the new city he was building at the mouth of the Blackwater River, and melted down by Balerian's fire into a single seat. The result was not comfortable. It was never supposed to be. Aegon's stated philosophy, or the philosophy attributed to him by later chroniclers, who may have sharpened his thinking into something more epigrammatic than the original, was that a king should not sit easy. That the discomfort of the throne was a reminder that the power it represented was not a comfort, but a responsibility. The throne was enormous and irregular and ugly, in the way that things forged from violence tend to be ugly, not in a failure of craftsmanship, but in the nature of the material. Swords melt into shapes that remember being swords, and the Iron Throne looked like something that had once been weapons and had not entirely forgotten it. Later kings would cut themselves on its edges and draw blood, and this fact was interpreted by those inclined towards symbolism as a statement about the nature of kingship. Joffrey, centuries later, would sit on it and find it uncomfortable and resent it, which tells you something about Joffrey. Daenerys would dream of it for years before she ever saw it. And when she finally did see it, or rather, when she dreamed of walking through the ash of a destroyed throne room toward it, with snow falling through the broken ceiling above, it would be already gone. Aegon ruled for 37 years after the conquest. He was a patient king, though not a passive one. He spent much of his reign managing the consequences of what he had done, which were considerable. He had united 7 kingdoms that had no interest in being united, and no shared history of unity to draw on. He had to build the apparatus of a central government from nothing, with the help of the small council he assembled, the maesters who served as his bureaucracy, and the system of allegiances that he had won through a combination of fire and diplomacy and the strategic use of mercy. He built King's Landing from a trading town into something worthy of being called a capital. He built the Red Keep. He also built the Watch, or rather, he renewed it and reinforced it, and sent men to the Wall, because the prophecy was always there in the back of his mind. The long night would come again. The Wall needed to be manned. The Night's Watch needed resources. And so the king of the newly unified Seven Kingdoms spent some of his treasury and some of his influence on an ancient organization guarding an ancient structure against a threat that most of the people south of the Wall considered historical, rather than ongoing. No one paid much attention to this at the time. It seemed like an old man's eccentricity, or a king's superstition. But the Wall was manned, and the Watch endured. And 3 centuries later, when the dead began to walk, there were still brothers on the Wall to receive the first reports and attempt, however inadequately, to prepare. Let your breathing be slow, and even now, the conquest is over. The world has been remade, not entirely, not without cost, not in a way that resolved all of the tensions it created. But the Seven Kingdoms exist now as a single political entity, held together by the existence of 3 dragons and the will of a man who dreamed a dream he inherited and believed in more than he believed in anything else. There is more. There is always more. But for now, let this settle. The image of a throne forged from defeated weapons, and a family that had come from the edge of one catastrophe, and built something to stand between the world and the next one. Let it be quiet for a moment. Let the dragonfire cool. Let the smoke thin. The night is long. The history will keep. Your watch is not yet ended, but your rest is earned. Breathe slowly, and let the story hold you. The conquest had cost Westeros enormously, but the generation after Aegon would cost the Targaryens something just as large, and what they spent it on was each other. And on a religion that decided the family sitting on the Iron Throne was an abomination. What the dragons could not burn, it turned out, was the faith of ordinary people who had decided they had had enough. Let the quiet return. Let your shoulders settle. Let the image of the conquest, the fire, the field, the melted towers of Harrenhal soften now into something more distant, more still, the way a battlefield looks the morning after the armies have gone, and only the grass remembers what happened. We are moving forward in time, into the reign of the man who inherited Aegon's throne without inheriting Aegon's certainty, and into the era when the Targaryen dynasty first discovered something that would trouble it repeatedly across its 300-year history. That fire can hold a continent, but it cannot make a continent love you. Aenys Targaryen was the firstborn son of Aegon the Conqueror. He was not, by any temperament or disposition, a conqueror. He was a gentleman, a curious man, a man who loved music and learning, and the company of people who could tell him interesting things about the world. He had grown up watching his father govern through a combination of dragon-backed authority and carefully deployed mercy. And what he seems to have taken from that education was primarily the mercy and not enough of the authority. He was beloved by the small folk in the way that well-meaning rulers often are. They sensed his genuine warmth and appreciated it, and they were not entirely wrong to do so. The problem was not that Aenys was a bad person. The problem was that the Seven Kingdoms in the aftermath of conquest needed a king who could manage forces that did not respond to warmth. Those forces were primarily the faith of the Seven. The faith was the dominant religion of Westeros outside the north, old, institutionally powerful, woven into the daily life of the common people, in ways that made it effectively ungovernable by royal decree alone. It had its own hierarchy, its own wealth, its own relationship with the small folk that predated the Targaryens by centuries. And it had, from the beginning of the Targaryen reign, a specific and articulate objection to the dynasty sitting on the Iron Throne: incest. The Targaryen tradition of marrying within the family was not, by the standards of the faith of the Seven, a cultural difference to be tolerated. It was an abomination. It was explicitly and clearly condemned by the doctrines of the faith. And the fact that the king who sat on the Iron Throne was the product of a brother-sister marriage, and had himself contracted marriages that the faith considered sinful, was a wound in the relationship between crown and church that Aegon's personal authority had managed to keep from fully opening. Under Aenys, it opened. The nature of the faith's objection deserves more than a passing observation. The faith of the Seven was not a fringe movement of zealots looking for a cause. It was the religious framework through which most of the people of Westeros understood the world: birth, marriage, death, seasons, harvest, justice, the proper ordering of the family and the kingdom and the cosmos. It had been in Westeros since long before the Targaryens arrived. It had temples in every city, septs in every town, silent sisters who tended the dead, and sparrows who wandered the roads. To say that the Targaryens violated its teachings was not to say they had offended a special interest group. It was to say they had stood in the center of the way most people organized their understanding of what was right, and declared by their existence that those people were wrong. Aenys, who wanted to be loved, could not understand why being who he was made him unloved in places that had no cause to know him personally. The faith explained it. The faith was always explaining it. The faith militant, the military arm of the faith, warriors consecrated to the defense of the religion against heresy and sacrilege, rose against the crown during Aenys's reign. They did not simply protest or petition. They killed. They attacked Targaryen supporters. They marched on King's Landing. Aenys, faced with an insurrection that his temperament had not prepared him for, fell ill. The precise nature of his illness is debated. Some accounts suggest a genuine physical collapse. Others that he was dosing himself with potions that were not helping him think clearly. What is clear is that he died on Dragonstone, and what he left behind was a kingdom in open revolt, and a throne that needed someone far less gentle to reclaim it. Maegor was Aenys's half-brother, the son of Aegon and Visenya, rather than Aegon and Rhaenys. He was, from everything the histories record, a man of extraordinary physical capability and extraordinarily limited patience. Where Aenys had been warm and uncertain, Maegor was cold and absolutely certain about nearly everything, in the way that people who have never questioned their own capacity for violence tend to be. He took the crown by force, setting aside the legitimate claim of Aenys's own son, and he made clear from the earliest days of his reign that the faith militant would receive a different answer than the one Aenys had been considering. His answer was fire. Maegor the Cruel, the name was not given affectionately, and it was not given by enemies alone, suppressed the faith militant with a thoroughness that settled the immediate crisis while creating wounds that took generations to properly close. He destroyed their organizations. He burned those who would not renounce their military role. He engaged the leading figures of the uprising in personal combat and won repeatedly and did not spare those he defeated. There is a particular quality to Maegor's violence in the records. Not the hot explosive violence of anger, but the cold, methodical violence of a man who had decided that the problem was best solved through thoroughness, and who applied thoroughness in the way a craftsman applies technique, without personal feeling, without hesitation, without afterward wondering whether it had been necessary. He built the Red Keep. This is an important fact, and one that is easy to overlook in the spectacle of his brutality. The Red Keep, the castle that would eventually house every Targaryen king and queen, every small council, every conspiracy and banquet and execution that takes place within its walls in the events the listener knows, was built by Maegor. He commissioned it, oversaw its construction, and was responsible for one of the most chilling decisions in the history of its building. When the Red Keep was finished, he executed the builders, not to be cruel, or not only to be cruel, but to ensure that no one outside the royal household had full knowledge of the castle's layout. The secret passages, the hidden rooms, the dungeons beneath the dungeons. The men who built them took that knowledge to their graves. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The passages that Arya Stark will one day discover and use to move through King's Landing invisibly, the hidden geography of the Red Keep that allows conspiracies to hatch and secrets to move, all of that was built by men who were then killed to keep it secret. Every secret the Red Keep has ever held is resting, in part, on the silence of the people who were killed to ensure that silence. This is the kind of historical fact that tends to get mentioned briefly in chronicles and then passed over. It deserves more than that. Maegor's reign was short, 6 years, and ended in a way that the histories have never been able to fully explain. He was found dead on the Iron Throne one morning. Seated on it, as if he had died in the act of ruling, his wrists cut, bleeding out onto the floor beneath the throne. No one confessed to killing him. No one was accused. The official position then and now was that he simply died, that the Iron Throne had cut him, as it sometimes cut kings, and that the cut had been deeper than usual. Many people at the time, and many historians afterward, found this explanation inadequate. The more common private theory was that someone with access to the king and the king's trust had made a decision that the realm could not survive more of what Maegor was doing to it. Who that someone was, if they existed at all, is one of the cleanest unsolved mysteries in the entire history of the dynasty. What Maegor left behind beyond the Red Keep and the suppressed faith and the bodies of the builders was a precedent. The Targaryens had now demonstrated that the power they held could produce both the warm, beloved, ineffective king who falls apart when challenged, and the cold, brutal, effective king who solves his problems with fire and is then found dead in the night. Neither option was acceptable as a permanent mode of governance. The dynasty needed something different, someone who could be strong without being Maegor, and kind without being Aenys. What it got, in the form of Jaehaerys, was something that surprised everyone by actually working. The echoes of Maegor and Aenys in the later history of the dynasty are not subtle. Aerys, too, the Mad King, the man whose paranoia and violence would eventually bring down the dynasty entirely, had something of Maegor in him, in the specific quality of his cruelty. Methodical, preoccupied with fire as an instrument of judgment, convinced that fear was the appropriate response of the governed to the governing. And Viserys too, later, and Joffrey Baratheon, who carried Targaryen blood through his mother, had something of Aenys. The desire to be loved, the confusion when love is not forthcoming, the collapse of composure under pressure, The dynasty seemed to oscillate between these poles for generations, producing occasionally someone who found the balance, but more often someone who fell to one extreme or the other. The small folk of the Seven Kingdoms, in the centuries of Targaryen rule, learned to read the signs early. There were tells, ways that a Targaryen king announced by his behavior in the first years of his reign which way his nature was going to pull. The lords of the great houses developed a form of political wisdom around this reading. How to position yourself, how to stay useful rather than threatening, how to survive a Maegor without being destroyed by a Maegor. House Lannister became particularly good at this. Their survival across 300 years of Targaryen rule was not accidental. It was the product of an institutional intelligence about how to remain valuable to whoever happened to be sitting on the Iron Throne, regardless of what that person was like. Cersei Lannister, looking at the dynasty she married into through Joffrey, would have recognized both Aenys and Maegor in her son, the desire to be loved, and the capacity for cruelty that emerged when love was not forthcoming. She would have understood the danger of that combination better than almost anyone else in the court. What she would not have been able to see because she was too close to it was that her son represented not just the failure of a particular king, but the end point of a particular trajectory, the place where the dynasty's recurring inability to find the balance finally ran out of room. Let that settle. Let the Red Keep take its shape in the soft darkness behind your eyes, its towers, its hidden corridors, its foundations built on silence. Think of all the people who have moved through those halls across 300 years, and all the things that happened there, and how all of it traces back to a cruel man who built a castle and then killed the people who built it for him. There is something very human about that, in the most uncomfortable way. And there is something very Targaryen about it too. Rest now. Let the image of the throne, empty and waiting for its next occupant, be the last thing that fades as your breathing slows. The story will continue. The history will keep. And your watch, for this moment, is ended. If this history of House Targaryen is carrying you somewhere restful tonight, consider subscribing to Factonium, Facts Unlocked. New sleep documentaries arrive regularly, each one a new world to drift through at the end of the day. Sleep well, and we will see you when you return. After the brutality of Maegor, the kingdom needed something it had never had before. A Targaryen who could make peace with the things that fire cannot fix. What came next was the longest reign in the dynasty's history, and the closest the Seven Kingdoms ever came to something that deserved to be called a golden age. And yet even this brightness was threaded through with a sorrow that the histories tend to move past too quickly. Breathe slowly. Let the tension of the previous age release, the way smoke finally clears when the wind shifts. We have arrived at a different kind of Targaryen story now. Not a story of fire and cruelty and the desperate assertion of power, but a story of patience, of legislation, of two people who seem to have genuinely understood each other, and to have used that understanding to build something that lasted. Jaehaerys I, the conciliator, the old king. He ruled the Seven Kingdoms for 55 years, longer than any Targaryen before or after him, and by most measures he was the best king the dynasty ever produced. The tragedy of that assessment is that it is delivered in retrospect, and what it shows is not simply the achievement of his reign, but the distance between what the Targaryens were capable of at their best and what they most often actually were. Jaehaerys came to the throne as a boy and died as a very old man, and the arc of his reign is one of the most complete and moving stories in all of Westerosi history. He inherited a kingdom that was still bleeding from Maegor's cruelties, lords who had been broken or frightened or both, a faith that had been beaten into submission but not reconciled, a small folk who had learned to be afraid of the crown in a way that was not useful to anyone. He was 14 when he took the throne, and his first major acts were not fire, but conversation. He reached out to the High Septon. He acknowledged the wounds that the Targaryen tradition and the faith's teaching created between them. He did not ask the faith to accept Targaryen incest as right. He asked for a peace that acknowledged the complexity, that created room for disagreement without violence. The doctrine of exceptionalism, roughly stated, held that the Targaryens were touched by something beyond ordinary human understanding, and that the ordinary rules of the faith applied to ordinary people. It was theologically convenient, philosophically questionable, and politically essential. The faith accepted it. The violence ended. His queen was Alysanne, Queen Alysanne Targaryen, called Good Queen Alysanne, a name that carries more warmth in it than most royal epithets manage, was his sister and his partner in nearly every meaningful sense of the word. She was politically astute in ways that complemented his more systematic approach to governance. She travelled the kingdom in a way that Westerosi queens had not previously done, rode her own dragon Silverwing, went north as far as the Wall, visited the Night's Watch, persuaded Jaehaerys to double the Watch's lands in acknowledgement of the essential nature of their work. The Black Gate, the expansion of Castle Black's resources, the attention paid to an organisation that the rest of the South considered a dumping ground for criminals and failures, all of this owed itself largely to Alysanne's intervention. She had not read the same prophecy Aegon had left, but she seems to have understood in a more intuitive way that the North mattered in some deep sense that couldn't be entirely accounted for by political analysis. She also reformed the inheritance laws around women's rights, expanded the authority of the maesters in certain areas, established the first royal orphanages, and generally conducted herself with the kind of practical compassion that makes good governance feel less like a system of rules and more like a conversation with the people being governed. The small folk loved her with a warmth that was not simply the reflexive affection that attaches to distant royalty. It was specific. It was earned. When she died, people who had never met her wept. Alysanne's visit to the Night's Watch deserves particular attention because it represents one of the only moments in the entire history of the Targaryen dynasty where someone in power actually went to see the Wall and came back changed by what they saw there. She flew north on Silverwing, and Silverwing, a dragon who had survived the dance, who would outlive Alysanne herself by decades, refused to cross the Wall. The dragon would not go beyond it. Alysanne wrote to Jaehaerys about this with a mixture of wonder and unease, and what she communicated was not simply a curiosity about a dragon's behaviour, but something more like a recognition that there were forces at work north of the Wall that were older and stranger than the political calculations that governed everything south of it. She did not have the words for what she sensed. She was not a prophetess in the way Daenerys had been, but she acted on it. She added resources to the Watch. She petitioned Jaehaerys to extend their lands. She treated the men on the Wall not as criminals doing time at the edge of the world, but as men doing necessary work that the world would not thank them for. That quality of attention, of seeing people who had been rendered invisible by their position, was perhaps her most distinctively personal contribution to the history of the realm. Jaehaerys also built the King's Road. This sounds like an administrative achievement, And it was, but it was more than that. The King's Road, the great north-south highway that runs from the Wall to King's Landing, through the heart of Westeros, changed the physical experience of living in the Seven Kingdoms in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate without remembering what travel had been like before it. It connected regions that had previously been separated by the simple brutality of distance. It moved goods and people and information at speeds that were genuinely unprecedented. It made the Seven Kingdoms feel, for the first time, like a single place, rather than 7 separate places that happened to share a king. When Arya Stark, fleeing King's Landing centuries later, finds herself on that road, when it becomes the geography of her escape and her wandering, she is walking on something that Jaehaerys built. The road is not just a road, it is a physical manifestation of the idea that the Seven Kingdoms are one thing, which is itself an idea that Aegon had, but that Jaehaerys was the first to make real in the texture of daily life. You can believe in an idea, or you can build a road. The road outlasts the belief. But the history of Jaehaerys' reign is not all achievement and peace and the quiet satisfaction of good governance. The later years of his reign were marked by a grief that the chronicles tend to record carefully and then move past too quickly, as if grief is an interruption of history rather than a part of it. Jaehaerys had 13 children with Alysanne. He lost most of them before he lost her. The deaths came over decades, not all at once, not in a single catastrophe that could be processed as catastrophe and then survived, but in the accumulative way that loss tends to arrive in long lives, one child at a time, each one its own separate devastation, each one requiring a new act of grief that somehow had to coexist with the ongoing act of governance. His son Balon died young, and the question of who would inherit the throne became the most pressing political issue of the reign's final years. Jaehaerys had a granddaughter, Rhaenys, daughter of his deceased son Aemon, whose claim was arguably stronger than her cousin Viserys's, based on birth order, but she was a woman, and the tradition that had developed across Westeros, not a formal law, but a strong custom, held that the throne passed through the male line. A great council was called, the largest gathering of lords the realm had ever seen, to decide the question. The lords chose Viserys, Jaehaerys' grandson through his son Balon. Rhaenys was passed over. She was called afterward the Queen Who Never Was, a name that contained an entire history of what the kingdom had decided women's claims were worth when they competed with men's. This moment, the Great Council of 101, is worth sitting with, not because it was unusual, but because it was definitive. The decision made that day would haunt the dynasty for the next 3 decades, because the same question, what does a woman's claim mean when it competes with a man's, would arise again in the next generation, with Rhaenys' own family at the centre of it. And the second time, the kingdom would not settle the question with a council. The second time it would be settled with dragons and fire, and the deaths of thousands of people. The Great Council of 101 was the last chance to find a peaceful answer to a question about succession that the Targaryens had never properly resolved. They came close. And then they walked away from the answer they had found and chose a different path, and the consequences were catastrophic. Jon Snow, 300 years later, would face a version of this same question. He is the true heir to the Iron Throne. By the patrilineal reckoning that Westerosi tradition uses, he ranks above Daenerys because he is the son of Rhaegar, and she is only Rhaegar's sister. But he does not want the throne. He has never wanted the throne. And Daenerys, who has spent her entire life preparing to claim it, who has crossed continents and lost friends and broken cities to arrive at the moment when it is within reach, she does not want to hear that the man beside her outranks her. The Great Council's decision echoes forward into that conflict too. Every choice the Targaryens made about succession and legitimacy and the weight of a woman's claim reappears eventually, usually at the worst possible moment, usually with consequences proportional to how long the original question was deferred rather than answered. Jaehaerys died in 103 years after Aegon's conquest. He had ruled for 55 of them. By the end, he was a very old man who had outlived most of the people he had loved most, including Alysanne, who had died years before him. The accounts of his final years describe a king still present, still functioning, still meeting with his small council and receiving reports, but diminished in the way that very old people are sometimes diminished. Not in intellect, but in the particular vitality that comes from having people to talk to who understand what you are talking about. He was the last of his generation. He was alone in a way that throne rooms and attendants and the machinery of government cannot alleviate. When he died, what he left behind was a kingdom that was, by the standards of Westerosi history, unusually well ordered. The roads were built, the laws were codified, the faith was at peace with the crown. The small folk were not comfortable. Small folk in medieval worlds are rarely comfortable, but they were not terrorized. The realm had not been at war for decades. By the metrics that historians tend to use when they are assessing the achievement of a reign, Jaehaerys had succeeded. And yet, the succession question was not settled. The nature of what it meant to be a Targaryen heir, whether blood flowed through sons only or through daughters too, was a matter of custom rather than law. And custom is not stable. The next king, Viserys, would face this question directly, and his handling of it would reveal exactly how much damage a well-meaning man can cause by refusing to make a clear decision, and then refusing to reconsider the unclear one he made. Let that be quiet for a moment. The 55 years of Jaehaerys, the roads, the peace, the lost children, Alysanne on her dragon, flying north to the wall, understanding something about that wall that she could not fully explain but acted on anyway. These things matter. These things are the texture of what the Targaryen dynasty was when it was doing what it was built to do. Let your breathing slow to its own natural rhythm. The history will continue. The peace will not last. Peace never lasts in stories or in history because the forces that disrupt it are always accumulating just outside the frame. But for this moment, let the peace be real. Let the King's Road run through the darkness of your closed eyes, long and straight and going somewhere. The night is long. The history will keep. Rest now, for what is coming will require that you have rested. What follows the death of a great king is rarely another great king. What follows, more often, is a good man who does not quite understand the size of what he inherited. Viserys I was not cruel. He was not stupid. He was, by most accounts, genuinely kind, and his court was a place of relative warmth and celebration. And it was under his reign that the dynasty planted the seed that would eventually destroy it. The seed was not malice. The seed was indecision. Let your breathing settle. Let the warmth of whatever rest you have already found deepen a little, without effort, without reaching for it. We are entering now the part of the Targaryen history that contains one of the most important lessons in the entire dynasty, a lesson about how catastrophe is made, not in a single moment of obvious wickedness, but in the accumulation of smaller failures, of choices deferred, of truths politely avoided until the world no longer has room for politeness. You do not need to be alert for this. You only need to be present. Let it come to you. Viserys I was chosen by the Great Council over the superior blood claim of his cousin Laena Velaryon, or rather, of Laena's mother, Rhaenys, the queen who never was. The choice was made on the principle that the throne passed through male heirs, and Viserys was the highest-ranking male heir available. He was a good-natured man, broad and cheerful, and fond of good food and good company, and the kind of court spectacle that made people feel that being in the presence of a king was a pleasurable experience. His first marriage, to Aemma Arryn, was warm and apparently genuinely affectionate in a way that was not always the case in dynastic marriages. They had one surviving child together, Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra Targaryen was, by every account, extraordinary. She was her father's favourite, not in the sentimental way that produces weakness, but in the deeper way of genuine recognition between people who share a particular quality of presence. She was bold, politically astute, a natural dragon rider of considerable skill, and she possessed a quality that her father's court noticed early. She was not afraid of being exactly what she was. This fearlessness was magnificent and useful, and would ultimately contribute to her destruction, because the world she lived in had very specific ideas about what a woman in her position was supposed to be, and she spent her entire life declining to be exactly that. When Aemma died, in childbirth, along with the son who was supposed to solve the succession problem by simply existing as a male heir, Viserys did something that seemed, in the moment, both natural and reasonable. He named Rhaenyra his heir. He had her recognized by the great lords of the realm, sworn to and acknowledged, at a ceremony that made her official in every way that ceremonies can make things official. And then, some years later, he married again. He married Alicent Hightower, the daughter of his Hand of the King, a political marriage, a match orchestrated in part by the Hightowers themselves, who were ambitious in the way that great houses tend to be ambitious when they see an opportunity opening. And Alicent bore Viserys' sons. Here is the problem. The sons of Alicent Hightower were, by the most common reading of Westerosi succession law, stronger claimants to the throne than their older half-sister Rhaenyra. Not because they were more capable or more suited to rule. By most accounts, Rhaenyra was a more natural leader than any of them. But because the precedent set by the Great Council, and the custom of the realm as it had developed over generations, said that a son outranked a daughter, Viserys had named Rhaenyra heir. He had done so publicly, officially, in a ceremony of considerable weight. And then he had produced sons, and he had declined, firmly, repeatedly, in the face of considerable pressure, to revise his decision. He maintained that Rhaenyra was his heir. He maintained this position for the rest of his long life. The problem was not the decision. A king can name who he wants as heir, if he has the authority and the will. The problem was the court. Because the court split. It split along lines that hardened across decades into something that began to feel less like a political disagreement and more like an identity. There were those who supported Rhaenyra, who called themselves the Blacks, for the colour of her Targaryen standard, and those who supported Alicent's eldest son, Aegon, who called themselves the Greens, for the colour of Alysanne had worn at a significant dinner early in the conflict. These were, in the beginning, labels rather than factions. But labels become factions, and factions become armies. There is a quality to the evidence of this period that historians of the realm have noted without always being able to name. The texture of ordinary court life in the reign of Viserys I was genuinely warm, genuinely celebratory, in ways that made the gathering storm nearly invisible to those standing inside it. People were not miserable during these years. The small folk had harvests. The great lords hosted each other and competed in tournaments and conducted the ordinary negotiations of dynastic life. Children were born, marriages were contracted, debts were paid and disputed and eventually settled. The ordinary machinery of a functioning realm ran with something close to smoothness. And underneath all of it, the faction lines were hardening, the loyalties were being quietly tested, and the people who would eventually fight a civil war were accumulating the specific grievances that civil wars are made from, slowly, in the way that dangerous accumulations always happen, which is to say, invisibly, until suddenly they are not invisible at all. Viserys refused to see it, or rather, and this is the more charitable and perhaps more accurate reading, he could see it, but he believed that his continued unambiguous support for Rhaenyra was sufficient to hold the thing together. He had named her heir. He would not revisit that. He continued to insist on Rhaenyra's primacy at court. He continued to suppress, as firmly as his gentle nature allowed, the arguments of those who said that his sons should take precedence. And he seems to have genuinely believed that his position would hold after he died, that the oaths sworn to Rhaenyra would mean what oaths were supposed to mean, that his lords would honour the commitment they had made in his presence. He was wrong about this, not because the lords were without honour. Honour in Westeros is a complicated thing, but it is not entirely empty. But because the oaths had been sworn under specific circumstances, to a specific person, and those circumstances changed the moment Viserys was no longer alive to enforce them. An oath to a living king who can call a dragon is one thing. An oath to a dead king is lighter. The lords who had nodded and sworn at the ceremony years before found, in the hours after Viserys' death, that their honour was operating in an environment that had become much more complicated than it had been when the oath was made. There is something here worth dwelling on. The way that a man's refusal to make a hard decision can be experienced by those around him as a kindness while he is alive, and as a catastrophe after he is gone. Viserys was kind. His court was warm. His refusal to choose between his daughter and his sons, his insistence that the question had already been settled when the rest of his court could see that it very much had not been settled, was not malice. It was not weakness of the spineless variety. It was something more understandable, and therefore more tragic than either of those. It was the behaviour of a man who loved several people who were in conflict with each other, and who believed that love was sufficient to prevent the conflict from becoming lethal. Love is not sufficient for that. It has never been sufficient for that, no matter how genuine or how deep. The court of Viserys was one of the most elaborate and beautiful in the dynasty's history. Great feasts, great tournaments, an atmosphere of celebration and culture that the small folk sensed, even at a distance, as a kind of warmth emanating from the Red Keep. His dragons were numerous. Not just Rhaenyra's dragon Syrax, not just the enormous Vagar, the last dragon from the age of the Conquest, now ancient and vast and terrifying, but many others. The dragon population was at something like its apex during the reign of Viserys, the largest concentration of living dragons since the Doom, a dozen or more, ranging from the old and enormous to the young and still growing. It was, in the most literal possible sense, the most powerful dynasty in Westerosi history had ever been. And it was, in those same years, quietly destroying itself from within. Daenerys Targaryen, reading what little history of her dynasty she could access in exile, would have found Viserys Thyrse's story painful in a way that was uncomfortably close to home. Her own Viserys, her brother, who dragged her from city to city, who sold her to Khal Drogo in exchange for an army, who called himself the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms without any apparent understanding of what a kingdom actually required of a king, had something of this in him. Not the warmth. Viserys, her brother, was not warm, or not reliably so, but the belief that the rightness of his claim was self-evident, that the world owed him a recognition it was withholding, that insisting loudly enough on what he deserved was a substitute for doing the things that made people want to give it to him. The tragedy of the brother Daenerys grew up with is that he was not entirely wrong about the claim. He was a Targaryen. The throne had been his family's. But the way you hold a claim and the way you earn the ability to enforce it are different things, and Viserys, her Viserys, not his historical namesake, never understood that difference. He died in a tent in the Dothraki grasslands, having been given a crown of molten gold by the man his sister had chosen over him. The historical Viserys died in his bed, at peace after a long reign, but both Viseryses died having failed to resolve the question their lives had been built around. The court separated. The factions hardened. Alicent Hightower and her father, Otto Hightower, the Hand and the Lords allied with them, including eventually several of the most powerful houses in the realm, began to prepare, quietly and then less quietly, for a succession that they had already decided would not go as Viserys had planned, and Rhaenyra, on Dragonstone with her own faction and her dragons and her legitimate claim and her absolute certainty that she was in the right, which she was legally, demonstrably, by every oath that had been sworn in her presence, waited, and raged, and waited. Let that image settle. A kingdom divided not by obvious villains, but by two sets of people who both had some version of right on their side, held apart by a man who refused to fully choose, and then died before the consequences of not fully choosing arrived. Let the warmth of Viserys's court fade, as all warmth fades. Let the cold come in, the way it always does, through the cracks in things that were almost but not quite strong enough to hold. Your breathing can be slow now. The world outside is quiet. Whatever the night brings, it does not require you to solve it tonight. The history is here, holding everything that happened, and it holds it without needing your help. Let it hold what is coming too. Let your eyes be still. Let the darkness behind them be a gentle one. The night is long, and what comes next is the longest, costliest night the Targaryen dynasty ever lived through. What the Dance of the Dragons actually was, when you strip away the poetry of the name someone gave it, was a civil war in which members of the same family used the last great weapons in the world to kill each other. And the tragedy, the specific, irreplaceable tragedy, is that the dragons they used were finite. There were not going to be more of them. Every dragon that died in the dance was a dragon the world would never see again. The Targaryens burned through 300 years of irreplaceable inheritance in 2 years of war. Let yourself rest more deeply now. Let the weight of everything you are carrying tonight release a little, the way a fist unclenches when sleep finally arrives. What we are entering now is the most devastating chapter in the history of House Targaryen. the chapter that the dynasty never fully recovered from, that changed the Targaryens from a dragon-riding family that happened to be kings into a royal family that used to ride dragons. The name given to it was poetic, the Dance of the Dragons. The reality was something far simpler and far worse. It was a war, and the currency it spent was irreplaceable. When Viserys died, the men of his small council made a decision in the hours after his death that determined everything that followed. They told no one else that the king was dead. They met in secret. And they decided Alicent Hightower, her father Otto, and those lords closest to their faction, that the crown should go not to Rhaenyra, who was Viserys' named heir, and who was at that moment on Dragonstone, but to Alicent's eldest son Aegon, the second of his name, a young man of 20 who had spent most of his life being aware that there was a question about whether he would be king, and who seems not to have wanted the throne especially, but who did not refuse it. Within a day of Viserys' death, Aegon had been crowned. Rhaenyra did not know. She was on her island, waiting for a message that never came, until different messages began to arrive, not from the council, but from allies who had their own sources of information in the capital. What she felt when she understood what had happened, when the shape of the betrayal became clear, the council's secrecy, the speed of the coronation, the fact that the oaths sworn to her during her father's life had apparently meant nothing when her father was no longer alive to hold people to them, is not recorded in ways that capture it fully. The chronicles note that she was enraged. They note that she wept. They note that she acted decisively. What they do not note, because chronicles are not equipped to note such things, is the specific quality of grief that must accompany the realization that something you have spent your entire life believing was real, that the oaths meant something, that the crown was truly yours, that the law would protect you, was more fragile than you understood. The war that followed lasted 2 years. The names and events of it are numerous and violent and full of the specific chaos that comes when both sides believe, with genuine conviction, that they are right. Aegon and Alicent's faction had King's Landing, the Red Keep, the Treasury, and the institutional weight of a capital city that had already crowned their candidate. Rhaenyra had Dragonstone, the loyalty of several great houses, and dragons, many dragons. And the crucial tactical reality of the dance was this: Rhaenyra's side had more dragons and more experienced riders, at least at the beginning, and this meant that for the first year or so of the conflict, the Blacks held something like a military advantage. But dragons died, and every dragon that died was gone forever. This is the fact at the center of the dance that is easy to state and nearly impossible to truly feel until you have spent some time sitting with it. Balerion the Black Dread had died peacefully in old age decades before the dance, and that death had been mourned as the passing of an era. But the deaths that came in the dance were not peaceful. They were violent, confused, mutually destructive. 2 dragons fought in the sky above the gullet, and both fell into the sea. Dragons died of wounds they could not recover from. Old Valyria, the last living dragon from the age of the Conquest, ancient and enormous, the dragon that had belonged to Visenya and then to others across the generations, finally died in combat with a dragon called Caraxes. Both of them died. Both of them. Sit with that if you can. Vhagar, 180 years old, the last living connection to the original 3 dragons who had burned the field of fire and melted the towers of Harrenhal, and been the instrument through which 7 kingdoms became one. Gone in a battle between cousins over a throne that neither of them would ultimately hold for long. Gone, and nothing like her would ever exist again. By the time the war ended, and it ended not with a decisive military victory, but with the exhausted, poisonous settling of attrition, with Rhaenyra murdered by her half-brother's dragon, and Aegon himself dead shortly after, almost certainly poisoned by those who could see that continuing to support him was no longer survivable. The Targaryen dragon population had been devastated. There had been more than 20 dragons alive at the beginning of the conflict. After the dance, there were 4. 4 young dragons, none of them fully grown, all of them traumatized in whatever way dragons are capable of being traumatized by the experience of a world that had tried to destroy everything around them. Aegon III was crowned in the aftermath. He was the son of Rhaenyra, of the losing side, which creates a particular historical irony in the fact that the throne still ended up in Rhaenyra's line, that all the suffering and loss did not ultimately redirect the succession away from where it would have gone if Viserys' named heir had simply been allowed to inherit. Aegon III was called Dragonbane, not because he had ever intentionally harmed a dragon, but because he had watched, as a small boy, his mother Rhaenyra eaten by his half-uncle's dragon Sunfire, watched the specific and unspeakable violence of it, and that experience marked him so deeply that he could never look at a dragon without the image returning. He hated them, or perhaps not hated, perhaps feared them with the specific quality of fear that comes from having learned what they actually are when they are not being ridden by someone who loves you. Under Aegon III, the remaining dragons declined. The causes are disputed. Some point to neglect. A king who did not love dragons would not prioritize their care. Some point to the magical dimensions of the Targaryen bond, that without riders who could form the deep connection, the dragons languished in ways that had nothing to do with food or shelter, but with something less tangible. Some point to the nature of the dragons themselves, who had perhaps been bred over generations in ways that made them dependent on the bond in ways their wild ancestors had not been. Whatever the cause, the dragons died, one by one. The last one died in 153 years after Aegon's conquest. She was small, far smaller than the dragons that had flown in the Conquest, far smaller than anything the histories described. She died alone in the bowels of the dragon pit, in the dark, and no one was there to witness it who bothered to leave a record of what it was like. The world without dragons was a quieter world. It was also, in a specific and not easily articulated way, a smaller one. Not physically smaller. The continents had not contracted, but experientially smaller, in the sense that one of the things that makes a world feel genuinely vast is the existence within it of things that are not subject to human-scale concerns. A dragon that is 200 years old and the size of a ship, that breathes fire, that melts stone, that can see in the dark and navigate at speed, and has survived empires and catastrophes. That creature makes the world feel less bounded, less predictable, less small. When the dragons were gone, the world was bounded by human limits again. And human limits are, in the final accounting, quite narrow. The Blackfyre rebellions came afterward, a series of armed challenges to the Targaryen throne by descendants of an illegitimate son of Aegon IV, who had been legitimized on his father's deathbed. Aegon IV, called the Unworthy and earning the name, was one of the worst kings the dynasty produced. Gluttonous, cruel in the specific way of people who have never been told no, dismissive of the suffering his whims caused in others. His legitimization of all his bastards in his final breath was either his last political act or his final act of malice, depending on which historian you trust. The bastards he legitimized included Daemon, who took the name Blackfyre from the sword Aegon had given him, and who became the figurehead of a rebellion that lasted for decades and 5 distinct armed conflicts across multiple generations. The Blackfyre rebellions are worth noting here, not because they are a dominant story in the Targaryen history, but because of what they reveal about the nature of the dynasty's grip on power after the dragons were gone. Without dragons, the Targaryens were kings the way other kings were kings. Better connected, better legitimized, backed by the weight of history and the institutional structures Jaehaerys had built. But vulnerable in the way that any powerful family is vulnerable when it cannot call down fire from the sky. The Blackfyres could not have happened if Balerion was still alive. They could not have persisted for 5 rebellions if Vhagar still patrolled the skies of Westeros. The dynasty survived them, but it survived them in the way that a body survives illnesses that it once would have shrugged off, more slowly, with more cost, with effects that lingered longer than they should. Daenerys Targaryen, hatching her dragons in the Dothraki grasslands, was not simply reclaiming a throne. She was reclaiming the specific quality of power that had made the throne claimable in the first place. The moment the first crack appears in the largest egg, the moment Drogon pushes his way into the smoky air above Drogo's pyre, something returns to the world, well, as it had been absent for 150 years. Whether the world deserved to have it back is a different question, and one without a clean answer. But it came back. And with it came everything that dragons mean. The impossibility of containment, the redrawing of the map of what is possible, and the danger that always accompanies the return of something the world had been learning to live without. Let the dance be still now. Let the sky that burned be dark again, and quiet, and crossed only by ordinary things. Let the grief of it settle into something that can be held without requiring you to hold it tightly. The Targaryens lost something in those 2 years that they never got back. They knew it. The dynasty that survived the dance was a different dynasty than the one that had entered it. More careful, more defensive, more aware of its own mortality. Whether that awareness made them wiser or only more afraid is a question the next 150 years would answer in ways that were sometimes encouraging and sometimes not. Rest now. Let your breathing be its own slow rhythm. The night is long, and what remains of this history is long too, and it will keep for you through whatever sleep finds you. If this journey through the history of House Targaryen has been a companion tonight, consider subscribing to Factonium. Facts Unlocked. New sleep documentaries arrive regularly, each one a different world to drift through. Sleep well. We will see you when you return. After the dragons were gone, the Targaryens tried to get them back. For 100 years they tried. They searched for eggs. They attempted hatchings. They built the dragon pit for dragons that never came to fill it. And then, in a single night of fire, in a summer palace called Summerhall, the last serious attempt to restore what had been lost consumed almost everything the dynasty had built its hope on. What was left behind was a throne and a family without fire, and the slow, grinding question of whether that was enough. Let your body be still now. Let the warmth of the bed or the chair, or wherever you have found your rest tonight, be enough. Just enough, exactly enough, without asking for more than it has to give. We are moving through a quieter period of the Targaryen story now, a period that history tends to treat as a gap between the more dramatic episodes, as if the absence of catastrophe makes something less worth attending to. But the decades after the dance have their own texture, their own accumulated weight, and they contain something that matters enormously to everything that comes after. The story of a dynasty slowly learning what it was without the thing that had made it what it was. The kings who followed Aegon III were, in general, competent. This is worth noting because competence is not the norm in hereditary monarchy. The odds that the child of a capable ruler will also be capable are no better than the odds that the child of a skilled craftsman will inherit the skill, which is to say, not particularly good. The Targaryens had, by the end of the dance, shed the extremes of the early dynasty, the Maegor-style cruelty, the Aenys-style paralysis, and settled into something more middling, more human. Kings who governed through the ordinary mechanisms of governance, rather than through the extraordinary mechanism of Dragonfyre. And governing through ordinary mechanisms turned out to be harder than it looked, when the extraordinary mechanism had been doing so much of the heavy lifting. Daeron I, called the Young Dragon, crowned at only 14, launched a conquest of Dawn that had been tempting Targaryen ambitions since Aegon himself had been unable to complete it. He succeeded technically. His forces occupied Dawn, the Dornish submitted, the map was completed. Then the Dornish uprising killed him, and 50,000 Westerosi soldiers, and the map had to be quietly revised back to its previous shape. He was 18 years old when he died. He was brilliant, probably, and brave, certainly. And he had not fully understood the difference between winning a war and holding a peace, a distinction that his ancestor Aegon had spent 37 years working through, with dragons to help him. Without dragons, the margin for that kind of error collapsed entirely. Baelor the Blessed came after, a deeply religious king who walked barefoot to Dawn to ransom hostages, who imprisoned his own sisters in a tower for the crime of being women, he found tempting, who apparently fasted himself to death. He is remembered as a saint by some, and as a cautionary tale by others, and perhaps as both by the kind of historian who understands that the qualities that make people saints, and the qualities that make them cautionary tales, are not always as different as we would prefer. The dragon pit, empty of dragons, became a symbol of everything the Targaryens had lost. It had been built to house dozens of dragons in the heart of King's Landing. Massive, domed, its interior space designed to accommodate creatures that needed room the way mountains need altitude. After the dance, it housed a handful. After Aegon III's reign, it housed none. The empty dragon pit sat on its hill above the city, like a monument to an age that was over. And the people of King's Landing, who had grown up knowing the dragons were there, even if they had never seen them up close, seemed to have felt their absence as a persistent low-grade grief. Something had been taken from the sky. Something that had made the sky of King's Landing different from the sky anywhere else in the world. And now it was gone, and the dome was empty, and the chains inside it had nothing to hold. Several Targaryen kings attempted to restore the dragons. They looked for eggs in the ruins of the dragon pit. They imported tales of dragon sightings from the east, a rumour of dragons beyond the Bone Mountains, beyond the Shadowlands, in regions of Essos that most Westerosi had never travelled. They tried to hatch the eggs that surfaced occasionally in the Targaryen vaults, ancient, fossilized-looking things that had been sitting unused for so long that they no longer looked entirely like eggs, and more like very heavy, very strange stones. Occasionally these efforts produced something that might have been heat, or movement, or the impression of something stirring inside the shell. But the dragons did not hatch. The fire did not come back. Aegon IV, the unworthy, represents a particular kind of failure. He was not incompetent in the way of Aenys, not brutal in the way of Maegor. He was something arguably worse in a king. Indulgent without discretion, self-interested without the intelligence to disguise it, capable of recognizing the right action in almost every situation, and reliably choosing the wrong one instead. He kept numerous mistresses and fathered numerous bastards, and seems to have understood at some level that the trail of complications he was leaving behind him would eventually cost the realm significantly. He may even have understood this while he was on his deathbed, when he signed the decree legitimizing every bastard he had acknowledged. It was a final act of either sentimentality or nihilism or cruelty, depending on how you read the evidence, and it set the dynasty on a course that produced 5 generations of armed conflict. The Blackfyre rebellions, 5 of them spread across nearly 90 years, were the consequence. Demon Blackfyre, the first pretender, was given the ancestral Targaryen sword Blackfyre by his father, Aegon IV, and seems to have interpreted that gift as a signal that the throne itself was meant to be his. He was, by all accounts, a magnificent physical specimen and an inspirational military leader, and his cause attracted genuine support among those who had grown tired of the increasingly compromised Targaryen line. The Targaryens defeated him at the Battle of the Redgrass Field, where he died with 2 of his sons. It should have ended there. But it did not end there, because his descendants continued to carry the claim, and the claim had enough legitimacy, enough of the right blood, enough of the right grievances, enough of the right discontent among those who had reasons to want a different ruler, to produce 4 more rebellions before it finally ran out of momentum. What the Blackfyre rebellions reveal, more than anything else, is the nature of the dynasty's changed situation. Without dragons, the Targaryens were vulnerable to exactly the kind of dynastic challenge that the dragons had made unthinkable. A dragon changes the calculus of rebellion entirely, not just militarily, but psychologically. If you are going to rebel against a king who has a dragon, you have to be willing to face something that cannot be reliably countered. You have to be willing to die in fire, which concentrates the mind in specific ways. Without that deterrent, the Targaryens were competing on a level playing field with the other great houses, and a level playing field is a place where the most legitimate claim does not always win. Brynden Rivers, called Bloodraven, the bastard of Aegon IV, who served several Targaryen kings as Hand, Spy Master, and eventually went north to become the three-eyed crow who instructs Bran Stark centuries later, is one of the most interesting figures of this period. He straddled the legitimate and illegitimate branches of the dynasty with the comfort of someone who had never decided the distinction mattered. He was brilliant, ruthless, deeply versed in the old magic, and he operated in the shadows of the dynasty's decline with a quality of awareness that suggests he understood more about what was happening than any of the kings he served. He watched the Blackfyre rebellions. He watched the dragons fail to hatch. He watched the dynasty diminish. And then he went north, beyond the wall, to sit in a cave with roots growing through him, and to wait for whatever was coming next. That is a remarkable thing to sit with, if you let yourself. The man who had served as the backbone of the declining Targaryen state for decades, who had done the things that needed doing, who had seen through every conspiracy and crushed every rebellion, ended his story not in King's Landing, but beyond the wall, in a cave merged with a weirwood tree, becoming something that had more to do with the oldest magic of the first men than with the dragons of Valyria. As if the Targaryen story, at its most attenuated and exhausted, naturally bent back toward the north, toward the ice and the old wood and the magic that predated the Dragon Lords by thousands of years. And so, somehow, by the long and indirect road of 4 centuries of history, the thread came around to a man called Aegon V, known to those who had known him young as Egg, a boy who had travelled Westeros incognito as the squire of a hedge knight, who had seen the country that his family ruled as it actually was rather than as it appeared from the throne room. He was the rare Targaryen who knew the small folk not as abstractions, but as people he had met, shared meals with, understood in the specific way you only understand people you have had to sleep near and argue with and depend on. He became king without expecting to, outliving all the brothers who preceded him in the succession. And when he finally sat on the Iron Throne, he sat on it with an unusual quality of understanding about what the throne was actually for. He also wanted the dragons back. He wanted them back with a desperation that grew over the years of his reign into something that consumed him. He believed, had reason to believe, from the Targaryen prophetic tradition, that what was coming from the north would require fire to defeat it, and that the fire would need dragons. He had eggs. He had researched the old texts. He had, at last, a plan. And he carried that plan to his summer palace at Summerhall, in the hills of the Stormlands, on a summer evening in 259 years after Aegon's conquest. What happened at Summerhall that night is not fully recorded, because most of the people who were there died in it. What is known is that there was a great fire, that the palace burned, that Aegon V died in it, along with his son and heir and several members of his court, that the fire was not accidental. Something was attempted, some ritual or magical act intended to cause eggs to hatch, and that it went catastrophically wrong. No dragons hatched. What hatched instead was a catastrophe that killed the king who had spent decades preparing to restore what the dance had destroyed. On that same night, in a room adjacent to the dying palace, a woman gave birth. The child was born in smoke and sorrow, to the sound of distant screaming, into the hottest night the Stormlands had seen in living memory. His name was Rhaegar Targaryen. He would grow into the most gifted member of his generation, brilliant, melancholic, deeply marked by the sense that he had been born into a world that was ending, and that the ending was his responsibility to prevent. He played the harp beautifully, and the songs he played were almost always sad. Let that settle. Let the burning palace cool in the soft dark behind your eyes. The history has moved through fire and peace and diminishment and desperate hope, and it has arrived now at a birth, at a boy who will grow into a man who rides a dragon, who falls in love in ways that tear the world apart, who dies in a river fighting a man who does not understand what he was fighting for. But that is the next chapter. For now, only the birth. Only the smoke and the heat and the first breath of a child who had no idea what he was being born into. Let your own breathing be slow and even. Let the night hold you. The history will keep through whatever rest you find. And what comes next? The madness, the rebellion, the beginning of the end will be here when you are ready for it. The last Targaryen king began as something close to a good king. He was young and charming and genuinely well-intentioned, married to the woman he loved. Advised by a brilliant hand he trusted. The kingdom had every reason to expect a good reign. What it got instead was one of the most comprehensive descents into paranoid violence in the dynasty's history. The question of what happened to Aerys Targaryen and why it happened is the question that explains the world the characters of the main story inherited. Let your eyes be still. Let the warmth of your rest hold you gently, without gripping. We are coming now to the chapter that connects everything we have discussed tonight, to the world that Ned Stark and Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen actually inhabit. The chapter that explains why the Targaryens are in exile, why there is a new dynasty on the Iron Throne, and why the last surviving members of the house that once ruled the world are a young woman and her unstable brother living out of inns in the free cities with a single chest of possessions and the memory of a glory they never personally experienced. This chapter is the story of Aerys II. It is also, necessarily, the story of Rhaegar and of Lyanna Stark and of the man who became king by killing the most glamorous figure his generation had produced. Aerys Targaryen came to the throne at 18, in 262 years after the Conquest. He was handsome and charming and full of ideas, one of those young men who are so immediately impressive that the people around them temporarily suspend the habit of skepticism. His queen was Rhaella, his sister, and the match between them was by all accounts genuinely warm in its early years. His hand was Tywin Lannister, who was approximately his age and absolutely his superior in every quality that governance actually requires. Patience, organizational intelligence, the ability to make hard decisions and live with the consequences. The first years of Aerys's reign were, largely because of Tywin, competent. The realm was administered, the finances were addressed, the lords were managed. From a distance, it looked like the dynasty had found a way forward. The cracks were there from the beginning, if you knew where to look. Aerys had an imagination that ran toward grandeur. He wanted to rebuild Harrenhal on a scale that would make the original look modest, a project that would have consumed the treasury of several kingdoms to complete, and that Tywin managed to quietly redirect without allowing the king to notice he was being redirected. He had enthusiasms that cycled quickly and left behind them the wreckage of half-completed commitments. And he had, beneath the charm, a quality that only those closest to him recognized in the early years. A tendency to see, in the behavior of people around him, patterns of disrespect or conspiracy that others could not see because they were not there. A king's suspicion, when it begins to malfunction in this way, is one of the most dangerous things in the world, because a king's suspicion has instruments, prisons, executioners, Dragonfyre, that most people's suspicions do not. The defiance of Duskendale was the event that transformed the cracks into something structural. Aerys made the decision, against Tywin's counsel, against the counsel of most of his small council, to travel in person to the town of Duskendale, to address a lord's refusal to pay taxes. It was a poor decision, the kind that results from a combination of impulsiveness and the conviction that one's personal presence is sufficient to resolve any situation. The Lord of Duskendale took him prisoner. Aerys was held for 6 months. He was not tortured in the way that leaves obvious marks, or not only in that way. He was isolated, controlled, uncertain of whether rescue was coming, and the 6 months of that experience changed something in him that did not change back. Tywin eventually led an army to Duskendale, rescued the king, and sacked the city. Aerys emerged from captivity convinced that betrayal was everywhere, and that trust was a form of vulnerability that kings could not afford. The pyromancers became his closest advisors, the guild of alchemists who produced wildfire, the substance that burned through water and could not be extinguished by ordinary means. They flattered him in ways that more honest advisors had stopped doing, told him he was the greatest king the dynasty had produced, encouraged his conviction that fire was the answer to every problem that resisted other solutions. Tywin resigned as Hand, a resignation that Aerys made uglier than it needed to be by insisting on humiliating the most able man in his kingdom on his way out the door, because Aerys had become unable to tolerate anyone who reminded him of his own limitations. Tywin left for Casterly Rock. He did not come back to court. The burnings began. It would be wrong to say they were random. Aerys always had reasons, or believed he had reasons. But the distance between the reasons he believed in and the reasons an impartial observer would recognize grew steadily over the years of his later reign. He burned lords who had offended him. He burned advisors he had come to distrust. He burned prisoners. He burned, according to some accounts, simply because he could, because fire was the thing that made him feel like the king he believed himself to be, the inheritor of Aegon the Conqueror, the possessor of something the other lords lacked, the living proof that the Targaryens were still what they had always been. He kept saying the words, fire and blood. He kept saying them as if repetition could make them true again, could restore to the dynasty something that had been lost 100 years before he was born. His son Rhaegar watched. Rhaegar Targaryen, born in smoke and sorrow at Summerhall, grew into a young man of unusual qualities. He was intellectually serious in a way that Targaryens were not always serious. He studied history and prophecy with genuine rigor, not as decoration, but as inquiry. He played music with the kind of skill that comes from treating an art form as a language rather than a performance. He was not unaware of what was happening to his father. He could not have been. And the awareness shaped him in a way that was visible to those around him. Rhaegar was always at some level preparing, studying, waiting for the moment when he would need to act. He believed the prophecy. He believed that the prince that was promised was coming, that the long night was approaching again, that the world needed something specific from the Targaryen line. He was never entirely sure whether he himself was the prophesied figure, or whether he was the father of the prophesied figure. He went back and forth on this. The tourney at Harrenhal in 281 years after the Conquest was the moment that everything began to accelerate. It was the largest tournament the realm had seen in decades, a gathering of lords and knights from across the Seven Kingdoms, held at the ruins of the castle that Balerion had melted under the eye of a Targaryen king who was by that point becoming visibly unstable. Rhaegar competed. He was, by all accounts, the finest knight of his generation. He won the tourney, and then he did something that the assembled lords and ladies and witnesses had not expected. He rode past his own wife, Elia Martell, and placed the winter rose crown of victory in the lap of Lyanna Stark, the young daughter of the Warden of the North. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. The most celebrated knight in the kingdom, having won the greatest tournament in a generation, rides past his wife, in public, in front of everyone, to give the prize to another woman. In a single gesture, he had created a political situation that could not be walked back. Whatever his intentions, and there is reason to believe his intentions were entangled with the prophecy, with his conviction about who the mother of the promised prince needed to be, the public reality of what he had done was what everyone saw. Lyanna Stark was a betrothed woman. She was promised to Robert Baratheon, and the Crown Prince of the Seven Kingdoms had just made an unmistakably public statement about her in front of half the realm. What followed? The disappearance of Lyanna, the deaths of her father Rickard and her brother Brandon at Aerys' command, the rebellion that united the Starks and the Baratheons and the Tullys, and eventually even the Lannisters against the crown, moved very quickly, in the way that things move quickly when enough pressure has accumulated for long enough. Robert Baratheon, who genuinely loved Lyanna in the uncomplicated and consuming way that young men who have never been denied anything love the first person who seems to mean something to them, became the natural leader of the rebellion. He was everything Rhaegar was, in military terms, without the complications. A straightforward fighter, extraordinarily capable, without the layers of melancholy and prophetic preoccupation that made Rhaegar simultaneously fascinating and ineffective as a leader. They met at the Battle of the Trident in the river in 283 years after the Conquest. Robert with his warhammer, Rhaegar in armor with rubies worked into the breastplate. They fought in the water, which must have been cold. It was not winter, but the Trident runs cold in the best of months. And Robert's hammer found Rhaegar, and the rubies scattered across the river, catching what light there was in the churning water. Rhaegar died saying a woman's name. The histories disagree about which woman. Most say Lyanna, a few say Elia, his wife, perhaps both, perhaps something else entirely that the dying mind reached for, and that the witnesses could not quite hear over the noise of the battle around them. He died without knowing what was happening to his father in King's Landing. He died without knowing that Tywin Lannister had finally moved his army, not to support the king, but to take the city the moment it fell, to ensure that the Lannisters were on the winning side. He died without knowing that Jaime Lannister, the knight he had personally chosen for the Kingsguard, the young man sworn to protect Aerys with his life, was about to walk up behind the king he was sworn to guard and put a sword through him. Aerys had ordered the burning of the city, had told his pyromancers to ignite the wildfire caches placed beneath King's Landing years before, enough wildfire to burn the city and everyone in it rather than yield. Jaime killed him before the order was carried out. He sat down in the throne afterward and waited for someone to come, and what came was Ned Stark, who found him there and called him Kingslayer, and could not bring himself to understand what had actually happened. Ned Stark then rode south to Dorne. He rode south because his sister was there, Lyanna, who had not been kidnapped, who had gone with Rhaegar for reasons that the history of the rebellion had simplified into villainy, because simplification was easier than the truth. He found her in the Tower of Joy, in the Red Mountains of Dorne, guarded by 3 Kingsguard who died to protect her. He found her in a room with petals on the floor, blue winter roses, the kind that had been placed in her lap at Harrenhal. He found her dying, and she whispered to him as the life went out of her, a truth that would define the next 17 years of both their lives. The child she had given birth to was not to be acknowledged. He was to be kept secret. He was to be safe. "Promise me," she said. "Promise me, Ned." He kept that promise for 17 years. He kept it through the raising of a boy who thought himself a bastard, through the silent weight of every instance in which Jon Snow was treated as less than he was, through every winter in Winterfell when the truth was in the room and could not be spoken. He kept it until the moment Littlefinger's knife was at his throat, and then he kept it a little longer, because even dying he would not break the promise. The truth went south with his head. It went north with Jon. It waited as true things wait in the places where it had been buried, in the memories of people still alive who knew, in the tower in Dawn where the roses had dried to dust, in the blood of a young man who grew up not knowing what he was. Let that rest now. Let the river close over the rubies. Let the Tower of Joy be quiet. Your breathing can be slow and even. The most painful chapter of this history has passed, and what comes next, in the final segment of this night's story, is the beginning of something new. The last survivors of a dynasty making their way in a world that had decided it was finished with them. And the dragons that had been lost for 150 years, waiting inside 3 grey-green eggs for the right fire to call them home. The night is long. The history will keep. Let your eyes be still after 300 years and 12,000 years before that. After the doom and the conquest and the dance and the death of the last dragon, after the burnings and the rebellions and the river full of rubies, after all of it, the Targaryen story came down to 2 frightened children on a ship in the night, sailing away from the only home they had ever known, carrying everything they had left in a single chest, and 3 stone-cold eggs that no one believed would ever hatch. Let your breathing settle into the quietest rhythm it finds naturally. Let the long arc of this history hold you the way a river holds everything that floats on it, without effort, without asking anything in return. We have come a long way tonight. 12,000 years of Valyrian civilization, the doom, the dragons, the conquest, the civil war that ended the dragons, the long diminishment, the madness of the last king, the rebellion that brought the dynasty down. All of it has been moving toward this final chapter, which is not an ending but a turning point. The moment when everything that seemed over revealed that it was not quite over after all. Daenerys Targaryen was born on Dragonstone during a storm. Her mother Rhaella died in the birth. Her father was already dead, killed by the knight sworn to protect him. In the throne room that had been built by Maegor the Cruel, in the city whose burning Aerys had ordered and Jaime Lannister had prevented. The city was now Robert Baratheon's city. The throne was Robert's throne, and the infant who arrived in the world screaming during the worst storm the island had seen in years was a problem that Robert's small council discussed in terms of how urgently it needed to be solved. She was a threat. She was a claimant. She was a baby, and she was a threat, because babies with certain bloodlines grow into adults with certain claims. And Robert Baratheon had not fought a war to leave loose ends. She was spirited away before Robert's agents could reach Dragonstone. Sir Willem Darry, one of the loyal Targaryen retainers, took the infant and her brother Viserys, who was 7 years old, and already, by most accounts, beginning to become the person he would end up being, across the narrow sea. They ended up first in Braavos, then in various other cities of the Free Cities, moving with the particular impermanence of exile. They spent years in a house with a red door in Braavos, a house with a lemon tree in the garden, a warmth and stability that Daenerys would spend the rest of her life associating with home, because it was the only version of home she ever actually had. When Willem Darry died, that stability ended. The house was taken. The security was gone. What remained was Viserys and Daenerys, and a chest of possessions that included 3 dragon eggs, traded across various debts and promises, and half-remembered obligations, and whatever dignity Viserys could maintain while selling their mother's crown to pay for food. Viserys sold the crown. This detail matters more than it should, perhaps, but it carries something real in it. The last concrete physical object that connected the Targaryen children to the dynasty their family had built over 300 years. A crown that had belonged to their mother, who died giving life to the girl standing next to him. Viserys sold it for travel money. He called himself the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms. He called Daenerys the price of an army. He spoke of the Iron Throne the way people speak of something they own, but have never actually held, with an entitlement that was not backed by understanding. He was not, in his private moments, a man without feeling. But he was a man whose feelings had curdled, in the long years of humiliation and dependency, into something that expressed itself as cruelty toward the one person he had complete power over. Daenerys grew up in the specific kind of fear that does not announce itself as fear, because it is simply the texture of ordinary existence. She managed her brother's moods, the way people manage difficult terrain, carefully, with constant attention to where the solid ground was. She loved him, in the way you love someone who was once the only safe thing in an unsafe world, even after they have stopped being safe. She forgave him things that should not have been forgiven, and understood him in ways that probably also prevented her from seeing him clearly. When he was sold to the Dothraki for the promise of an army he never received, when Khal Drogo, tired of his petulance, filled a crown with molten gold and pressed it on his head, she watched her brother die and did not look away. And what she felt in that moment, if the history is read carefully, was grief and relief in proportions she could not have articulated. The Dothraki world she had been married into was its own education. Khal Drogo had no interest in the politics of distant kingdoms. The Iron Throne meant less to him than the grass under his horse's feet, which was at least something he could actually touch. But Daenerys, who had been sold as a tool, discovered that she was not only a tool. She had the Valyrian quality, the warmth toward fire, the instinctive communication with something ancient and dangerous. And the Dothraki, who lived close enough to horses and prey, and the open sky to recognize non-ordinary qualities when they encountered them, began to treat her as something other than what she had arrived as. She became a Khaleesi, and then, in the peculiar way that her life had of accelerating unexpectedly, she became something more than that. Drogo was wounded in a raid, and the wound became infected, and a Maegor, a wise woman of the grass, offered Daenerys a bargain for his life that Daenerys accepted without fully understanding the terms. She understood the terms after. Drogo lived technically, but lived in a catatonic state that was not life by any meaningful definition. Daenerys made the decision that the mercy of ending it was hers to give. She built a pyre for her husband on the open plain under the open sky. She placed the 3 dragon eggs, cold and stone-heavy, inert as rocks, objects that her brother had spent years carrying without any apparent belief that they were anything other than ornamental, on the pyre with him. And then she walked into the fire. What happened when the fire went out? In the morning, in the ash, when the remaining Dothraki who had stayed to watch approached what should have been a ruin, is one of the most significant single moments in the entire history of the world this story takes place in. She sat in the ash, unburned. This alone was remarkable. But the Targaryens had always had a complicated relationship with fire. What was more than remarkable, what was historically unprecedented in more than 150 years, was what sat with her. On her shoulders, in the ash of her husband's pyre, 3 dragons, tiny, fragile, smoke-colored, impossibly alive, Drogon, Rhaegal, Viserion, named for Drogo, for Rhaegar, for Viserion her brother. Each name a grief she was carrying into the next part of her life, because that is what Daenerys did with grief. She named things after it and moved forward. The return of the dragons to the world is the event that changes everything that comes after, in ways that the first witnesses could barely begin to understand. In the short term, Daenerys now had the beginning of something, an authority that had nothing to do with political legitimacy and everything to do with the kind of power that rewrites the rules while everyone is watching. The Dothraki followed the Mother of Dragons in a way they had not followed the sister of the last Targaryen pretender. People responded to fire in a way they did not respond to claims. In the longer term, the world had been without dragons for 153 years, an entire era, multiple generations. And now they were back, and whatever the world had organized itself around in their absence, the balance of power, the calculus of military force, the assumption that Westeros would be governed by the arrangement of houses that Robert's rebellion had established, all of that was provisional now. Conditionally true, pending the growth of 3 dragons. Jon Snow, at this same moment, was on the wall. He had joined the Night's Watch, the institution that Jaehaerys had reinforced centuries ago, that Alysanne had travelled north to visit on her dragon Silverwing, that Aegon the Conqueror had supported because of the dream. The prophetic warning that what was beyond the wall was not finished, not ever going to be finished, not until someone dealt with it using the right kind of fire. Jon did not know any of this yet. He did not know that the dragons were hatching. He did not know that Daenerys existed, not really. He did not know that she was his aunt, or that he was the son of Rhaegar, or that his blood carried the same specific quality as the woman on the far side of the world stepping out of the ash, with fire-coloured wings above her. He only knew that the wall was cold, and that something was moving in the dark beyond it, and that the brothers who had manned this structure for 3 centuries had never really been sure what they were watching for, only that they were supposed to keep watching. The complete history of House Targaryen is, in the end, a history about fire. Not fire as a metaphor, or fire as spectacle, but fire as an inheritance, a thing passed from generation to generation, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes destructively, sometimes almost extinguished by the very people meant to tend it. The fire began in Valyria, in the mountains that breathed smoke, in the bond between a family and creatures that the world did not fully understand. It survived the doom by accident, or by grace, or by the dream of a young woman who told her father the truth and was believed. It remade a continent. It burned itself almost to nothing in a civil war that should never have happened. It sputtered and smoked for 150 years, refusing to die entirely. Maintained in the bloodlines of an exiled family who kept the language and the customs and the memory of something larger than themselves. And then, on a plain in Essos, in the ash of a pyre, it came back. 3 small, improbable lives, too small at first to be the weapons of conquest, too young at first to carry the weight of everything their arrival meant, but alive, genuinely alive, and in the world that Aegon had dreamed when he built his throne from his enemies' swords, in the world that his descendants had defended and contested and nearly destroyed and been exiled from, in the world that had organized itself around the assumption that the dragons were gone and were not coming back, in that world 3 pairs of wings opened in the morning air. The long night was coming. It had always been coming. And somewhere in Westeros, in the cold north of a continent that had been built on the unresolved promise of a prophecy, the dead were learning to walk. The Targaryens had always known. The knowledge had cost them everything and preserved them through everything, and it was still there, still true, still waiting to be acted on. The fire was back, the blood was ready, and the song of ice and fire, the song that Aegon the Conqueror had dreamed and Rhaegar had tried to compose, and Jon Snow had been born into without knowing it. That song was finally approaching the verse that everything before it had been preparation for. Let your breathing be still now. Let the arc of this long night close gently. The way a story closes when it has said the thing it needed to say, not with a bang, not with the exclamation of resolution, but with the quiet that follows the last note of a piece of music that has been playing for a very long time. The dragons are in the air. The wall still stands. Jon Snow is on it, watching the dark, and Daenerys Targaryen, the last dragon, the last dreamer, the woman born in a storm on the island where everything began, is moving westward at last, toward the home she has never seen, carrying fire. The history is complete, or not complete. Histories are never complete. But it has arrived at the place where you came in, the place where the story becomes the story you already know. What remains now is rest, the slow, necessary rest of someone who has travelled a long way tonight and arrived somewhere worth arriving. Let your eyes be still. Let your breathing slow to whatever it finds naturally. There is nothing left to hold on to tonight. The stories will be here tomorrow. The history will keep. And now your watch is ended. If this complete history of House Targaryen has been a good companion tonight, we would love for you to subscribe to Factonium, Facts Unlocked. New sleep documentaries are waiting. Other worlds, other dynasties, other long nights full of history worth resting inside. Sleep well. We will see you when you return. If you enjoyed this journey, let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. We are always curious about that. And if you have a topic you would like to sleep to next, leave it in the comments below. The archive is deep, and the night is long, and there is always more history waiting in the dark.